tried to cure last.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today for this session on transparency and corruption, which I'm told is the first time that the WEF's had a public panel on transparency and corruption. Previously, it's been behind closed doors or Chatham House, but credit to them, they've opened it up to the public and to the press. Also, this is being live streamed. If you want to tweet about it, if you care about Twitter, the hashtag is WEF23. So why are we here? Why are we talking about transparency and corruption at this summit of world leaders? I will confess I had some skepticism. Davos is perhaps not best known for being a place of transparency. It is behind closed doors. It is naturally a gathering of the elite. And there are several people in the wider audience, or rather group of participants who, at Davos, who I would personally, and I know a lot of my peers, would like to ask some pretty searching questions of. But at the same time, we are here today, and there is, as I said, there's got to be credit for holding this session. On a personal perspective, my career, I have focused on anti-corruption and trying to find out stories about that. My mother, she came to the UK from the Philippines in the 1970s as a direct result of corruption in the Philippines. She came here to fight, to earn the legal fees to pay to fight that battle back home. She'd never succeeded, but that fight sort of lives on. From the Guardian's perspective, we as journalists are under constant attack. And just last year, we lost one of our own, Dom Phillips. He was reporting in the Amazon, reporting about the destruction of the Amazon. He was murdered. There is, and it's something which really cuts to the heart of what we do. A fellow reporter, Bruno Ferreira, a specialist in indigenous issues, was also murdered. And legally, we fight, as journalists, a constant battle with powerful vested interests, be it companies, be it rich individuals. We're in the UK trying to get legislation to make it more difficult for companies and rich people to pursue really vindictive lawsuits against journalists, which try to silence what journalists do. They're known as slaps. And there are a few media organisations in the UK which are at the very moment being pursued through the courts for their reporting. You know, transparency and open journalism is under attack. And then if we look at the global stage, the conflicts that are dividing the world at the moment, the war in Ukraine, that has corruption at its heart. And if you look at attacks on democracy as well, in Brazil, the capital last year, they're all about disinformation. They're all about the lack of transparency. They're about what happens when a free and fair media doesn't get its voice or isn't heard properly, or the checks and balances aren't there. So to talk about these issues today, we have a very distinguished panel. I'm honoured to sit alongside them. We have Livia Leu, who is Switzerland's Foreign Affairs Secretary of State. We have Ambassador Samantha Power, who is head of the United States Agency on International Development, USAID. It's part of the Biden administration's, it's their main tool for delivering foreign aid, and anti-corruption is a big part of their mission. We have Nandan Nilekani, who's the co-founder of Infosys, one of India's biggest tech companies. Also happens to be the business partner of the father-in-law of our Prime Minister in the UK. Honoured to have you here. Delia Ferreira Rubio, who's the chair of one of the world's biggest civil society groups, organisations, Transparency International. You exist to fight corruption. And Kaeser, the chairman of Siemens, the giant German engineering company. So thank you all for joining us here today. I thought I'd start today with Delia and ask you to say why the fight against corruption matters, why it's so relevant and real to people's lives.
When we fight against corruption, we fight for democracy, for liberties, and for the life of people and the future of different people. Corruption is at the heart, as you have said, of many of our failures as society and many of our crises. From the Amazon deforestation that you have mentioned, to the Bangladeshi textile industries or textile fabrics fires, to the blast of the Beirut port, which destroyed neighborhoods, complete neighborhoods of the city. Lots of people died because of corruption, because there was someone not doing what they should be doing in exchange of a bribe, in exchange of some money or some privilege. So when we fight against corruption, in fact, we are not just asking information for the sake of information or because we are curious. We are fighting for the rights of people, the future of people, the possibility to live a good future, to develop their capacity to live in peace. And we are facing different types of corruption affecting geopolitical issues and also the ordinary life of people.
Yeah, and also to that point that corruption is not necessarily something, we shouldn't think of it as something that happens in other countries.
That's important because corruption is a global issue. The money that is lost to corruption in the countries we perceive as corrupt countries ends in the London city or in the antiques or art market in Geneva or other cities in Switzerland, or in the real estate in New York, or in the luxury industry in Paris. So even those countries that are perceived as developed, democratic, very solid and transparent, had a role to play in the fight against corruption. They don't have to act as enablers of corruption. On the contrary, they have to really perform the gatekeeper function, and that's the responsibility of all the countries in the world, not only the ones that are perceived as corrupt.
Yeah. Joe, you fought a very particular personal battle with corruption, which not long after you'd taken the top job at Siemens. Tell us about that, if you would.
Well, we really learned the hard way in Siemens, but we know it now. It was like 2006, November 2006. I was just in a job for a couple of months. And then we got a police raid at our headquarters. 200 armed police people came in and were searching the headquarters, and later on they've been searching other places. And we're like, okay, what's going on? And then that was the start of what then turned out to be the biggest known corruption scandal after World War II, at least in Europe. And so it was a big story. And then, you go there. Then we went back and said, what the hell is going on? And they said, well, there is this suspicion that you folks are money laundering and that you were bribing companies all over the place. And it was like, okay, now what? The thing was, I don't want to take too much of your time, but it's almost like a book. The thing was, I knew I didn't have anything to do with it. I knew that for myself, but others didn't, first of all. Secondly, I was there, it was, as I said, a couple of months, if at all, in a managing board. And so somebody must have known something, because otherwise it would not have happened, right? So, and I cut the story now because we could go on forever here. And at some point in time, then I thought, oh, now how do we deal with that, right? What to do? Search our own, or just wait and see whether they find something or something, And then I asked my former boss, who used to be the CFO of Siemens, Mr. Baumann. He said, well, you are probably in trouble. I said, that's one I know already. But tell me what is it that we need to do? He said, look, ask somebody who understands that. And then he recommended Arthur Levitt to me, who used to be the chairman of SEC. Because I was more concerned about the books and records first, because I was the CFO for 2 months. So I was obviously, and I was not yet in retirement age. So I really had a problem by all means. And then, then I flew over to the US and talked to Arthur and said, hey, what is it? He said, well, you better find somebody and try to do it yourself, do it proactively, find an independent law firm who helps you with that. Now, what I didn't know is that I was a suspect by definition. So I went out and said, okay, who could do that? And then we eventually came over. Debbie was in Plimpton, Mary Jo White at the time. She was the leading. And then we were meeting with them, and she said, well, why are you here? Shouldn't that be the board? I said, well, you need to clean it up one way. She said, well, maybe that is a different approach. So long story short, then I went back to the supervisory board and said, hey, you need to hire those people as an independent law firm. So we hired them, and then the first time, I remember that, first time then the team, there was a Plimpton team came over. It was right before Christmas. There was a Christmas market right in front of our headquarters in Munich. It was smelling like, the punch and stuff. Anyway, and whenever it's Christmas time, I think about that, even after 15 years. And so they came over, and then we said, look, we will do cooperate and everything else. But when they entered the room and the team was introducing itself, it was like ice. And then a few people already said, what do you want here? And I said, well, they help us to avoid the worst. And so I could already feel, So there might be a few people here who know more than this. So that was the first thing. Then the second topic was, then we were in a management board meeting. And I explained, I said, well, those people are helping us. Maybe we, get an independent investigation granted. And so they work together with the prosecutor and everything else. And then one person in the managing board, one of my colleagues said, well, send those people to the Munich site because they are the worst. Don't let them go to Erlangen because we are all clean in Erlangen. And I was looking at him and I said, if you are all clean in Erlangen, why don't you send them to Erlangen? And it was like, okay, then I knew I had a problem because I didn't know from those 10 people around here in that room, who is somebody who I can trust and I couldn't.
So
it was very bad experience. So kind of long story short, it was one of the most significant experiences in my whole life. And then we hired somebody from the outside, a CEO, who helped us clean up, Peter Löscher, who was extremely helpful because he was from the outside. So we cleaned it up independent with the independent law firm, together with the SEC, DOJ, Enforcement Division. And then the question was, okay, fine, we cleaned up the past. So how do we behave in the future? And so the problem was we could not afford to be wrong again. We could not afford to be wrong again. So therefore, we were putting, a safety net and a mattress and some sand, so just make sure that we are not going to be hurt again. But it took us potentially 2 to 3 years, till we, or maybe even 5, till we went from a rule-based system into a value-based system. And a company with 400,000 people in 200 countries of the world, only the FIFA and the Catholic Church have more countries they do business in. It's really hard. And from my experience, I can tell you, if you have that case, be open, be consequent, put a set of rules and a safety net because you can't afford to be wrong second time because you'll put you out of business. You'll put you out of business. That's exactly what it is. And the DOJ told me, said, if that happens again, you're out of business.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful message.
So that's the story. And today, we really believe that we know what we're doing. We have an extremely well-developed compliance system. Something goes wrong all the time. There's still bribery. There is still incompliance of processes and procedures, people behaving in a non-appropriate way. But everything we find out ourselves. And then go to the prosecutor and work together. We even, there was a case a few months ago where we found out that a person of our customer, they hated our competitor. So they gave our salesperson documents for a project. We found out, and then we went to our customer and said, hey, we have a problem here. And we even went to our competitor and said, look, we are not bidding here because we've got all your documents. So here this back. So this is something which you really love because this is a value-based system. And we have an effective compliance system in place where we find out ourselves, because the world is a bad place. And don't think it's going to get better. Fight it, and don't let it grow, but the world is not a good place.
Thank you, yes.
So sorry for going on and on, but this was really
it's a powerful story. Like, I think for a lot of people, for somebody who's lived through it. Nandan, I'm really interested in your experience in driving through anti-corruption reforms in India and your work with the public sector as well.
Yeah, that's right. So though I'm an entrepreneur, I took a break and joined the government for 5 years in 2009 and helped to build a digital ID system for the country. So 1.3 billion people on that. And it was very important because India was increasing expenditure on welfare, and the underlying way of identifying beneficiaries was very poor. And therefore, there were a lot of ghost and beneficiaries, and there's a lot of leakage of government money meant to go to individuals. So now with the ID system is linked to the banking system, and the government does straight-through processing. So if they want to give money to somebody, they just have to make an electronic transaction, and it goes directly into the bank account of the person. And so we now run the world's largest direct benefit transfer plan, and it goes directly into the bank account. And on the other side is a whole network of what we call as business correspondents, where you can go and withdraw money, and therefore completely streamline the retail distribution of benefits, both for food as well as for cash. And that dramatically has reduced corruption in the supply chain of government benefits. So that's just one example. I can give you many more. But a lot of my work is how to use large digital infrastructure to actually architecturally streamline and eliminate corruption by making it straight-through processing, hands-free, nobody gets involved, and the bargaining power is not with the supplier who can then demand a cut, but bargaining power shifts to the citizen.
Okay, so you should strip out those potential for corruption.
Yeah, so design it in a way that there's retail corruption, there's wholesale corruption. There are different approaches for that, but this is mainly for retail corruption.
Yeah, okay. Livia, you're representing the Swiss state. So I might be surprised to see you sitting here. Switzerland is known for its banking secrecy. Only less than a year ago at The Guardian, with loads of other partners, and I think it was actually part funded by USAID, we were working on a project about Swiss banking secrecy. So how do we square that circle?
Well, thank you very much. Well, I would like to say two things from a Swiss point of view regarding corruption and transparency. On the one hand, I want to talk about supporting other countries trying to overcome endemic corruption, and the other is, of course, to look at our own doorstep. The assumption is clear for everybody here. I think that anti-corruption and transparency are key to a country's well-being, and because corruption enriches the few but weakens the society as a whole. So this is the basic thinking. Regarding our development cooperation, we finance over 100 projects and programs in almost 30 countries, including projects to strengthen parliaments, media and civil society, plus promoting the separation of powers, access to information, and popular participation. So in a way, it's to strengthen democracy and the rule of law from in a bottom-up kind of way. Also, investing in digital transformation is crucial in this regard. We just heard about it. Last year, as to give you an example, in July, the Swiss president launched the Ukraine Recovery Conference together with President Zelensky in Lugano, which defined important principles for the reconstruction that is ahead of us in this country. The digital transformation of the public sector was a key ingredient, actually, of the so-called smart recovery architecture, and obviously also anti-corruption measures are part of the Lugano principles for reconstruction. And in fact, the Ukraine is an excellent example, because Switzerland already long before the current aggression of Russia against Ukraine, we started an e-governance for accountability and participation program in Ukraine, so in 2015. And over the past years, this has greatly helped the Ukrainian population. So we believe that digital transformation programs are really an essential tool to increase transparency and fight corruption. Regarding now your point about our banks, this is my second point. To say it a little in a pointed way, James Bond villains no longer have bank accounts in Switzerland. Because over the past decades, I think we have built up a robust system for combating money laundering and terrorist financing. This is obviously the case because we believe that a healthy financial center is important for the Swiss economy, and so is financial integrity. Financial sector accounts for approximately 10% of our GDP. So we have ranked in the top 10 countries with the least corruption for the past 7 years, and I think we will have soon a new ranking. The last from Transparency International in 2021, we were on rank 7. So we participate very actively in developing international standards against illicit financial flows and corruption, but also adopt these standards obviously into our own domestic law. Switzerland is also an active member of the international anti-corruption mechanisms like the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group or the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. So we are a strong implementer of international standards. But we believe in concluding that combating corruption obviously requires ongoing efforts on all levels, be it the media, be it NGOs such as Transparency International, and obviously the authorities must keep this issue very high on the agenda.
And on that point about rogue bank accounts, are you confident that you have done all that you can to ensure that those who are supporting the Putin regime, that they are not putting their money, processing it through Swiss bank accounts?
Yes, we are very strongly working on the sanctions, also working in an international context with the G7 working group on the repo task force. And we have our banks, by the way, have become extremely vigilant themselves, because and even go beyond what they would have to according to the sanctions that are in place in Switzerland. They regard sanctions all around the world, so they over-comply actually, because otherwise they pay a very high price. They know that.
Yeah. Samantha, could you sort of set the scene about how corruption is at the heart of what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, I mean, I don't have to. Putin, in his speech before he invaded, made very clear that it was the anti-corruption reforms that not only the Zelensky government, but civil society really from the outside just pressed and pressed and pressed. I mean, really, 2014, the prior invasion of Crimea and Donbass occurred, and at that time, Ukrainian society could have focused just on that conflict, just on that act of aggression, but instead decided to fight two fights at once. One, the military battles, and the other, the battle to strengthen the rule of law and the democracy. And if you look at the Ukraine of 2014 and the Ukraine of February 24, 2022, they're two different countries. Yeah. In terms of this. They're not perfect. It's not that there aren't, there aren't individuals who were corrupt or systems that need, far greater strengthening. But in terms of the judiciary, in terms of the anti-corruption bodies, my Swiss colleague just mentioned digitization. USAID funded, I think, 3/4 of the Ministry of Digital Transformation's efforts to embrace initially a tool like that, which has been so incredible in India in getting benefits and transactions, out to the most rural areas, out to the most impoverished communities, and has itself been a tool of economic growth and capitalization. That's how it started in Ukraine, something similar. But now the so-called Delia app, which is used by nearly 19 million of the 30 million eligible adults, just a single app, provides 120 government services. And it's not just that. Right now there's reconstruction, including that which Lugano helped spearhead, the Lugano conference. Every time there's a construction project, that's an opportunity for corruption. You go with your app, there's a QR code on every permit on a construction site in Ukraine. You go with your app, and the app takes you to the contracts for the individuals and the companies who are involved in the corruption. And then as a journalist or a civil society organization, you can dig into it. So even with this monstrous aggression, with apartment buildings and energy infrastructure obliterated on a daily basis, they're still plugging away. And we are now looking at taking this Delia app and seeing whether other countries where leaders were elected on anti-corruption platforms in places like Zambia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, whether this app can actually be exported and become a tool to not only provide social services, which is incredibly important in its own right, because democracy must deliver for citizens, but also to give citizens this power vis-a-vis their government. So the middlemen are not there anymore giving assurances. You can see with your own eyes, what does it work. If I could just take it beyond Ukraine just for a second and say, modern corruption is different. Transnational corruption is different. Our systems as a development agency and our systems writ large have to take account of the differences. They have to take, we now have, at USAID, we're now funding, our programs tend to work within silos, we have missions in 80 countries, so they work within a specific country. We can't, that's not going to keep up with the savvy and the sophistication of those who are stealing from their people. $1.26 trillion lost to corruption every year. That's 7 times the development assistance provided by donor nations. 7 times. That's how much is lost. That's how many development gains are being left on the sidelines because of corruption. So for us to work transnationally in a way that we are just really, getting going, creating investigative journalistic platforms that cross borders, we've created something called Reporter's Shield, recognizing that the autocrat's weapon of choice is not just violence and intimidation and jailing if they're in power, and an oligarch can work through those in power, but it's also the lawsuit.
Yeah.
And so we've created a new insurance pool of funds for journalists and civil society organizations who are uncovering corruption, recognizing that the incentives for the oligarch are to drive these companies, these actors, out of business. And the last thing I'd say is just we're issuing here, I've just launched here today a private sector engagement fund of about $50 million, a subset of which will be used for what we're calling a grand challenge on fighting corruption. And what is a grand challenge? We don't have time to go into it in great detail for other examples of it, but basically, if civil society organizations or companies come to us and say, we have an idea for how we can expose corruption that might exist in a supply chain, a tool, we have an idea, we just want to pilot it, we're not sure if it's the real deal, we will fund that piloting. And then as those ideas come forward, we will provide resources to the best ideas to scale them. And we've done this in public health. We've done this in food security to create drought-resistant seeds, and Ebola, during the Ebola epidemic, to get suits that were lighter so that the health workers weren't, sweltering in the hot sun of the equator during Ebola outbreaks in sub-Saharan Africa, just challenging the private sector to make new suits. And then they came back, they make new suits, and now those are the suits that are available in Ebola epidemics. We need to think in similarly innovative ways to incentivize more thought in the digital, but not only in the digital space, as to what can we provide those actors that are fighting this fight within systems and without.
That seems key. That you're talking about multiple different parts coming together. Why does it work like that? Why can't sometimes journalists have a bit of an adversarial relationship with governments and with companies, but where can we?
Well, we're seeing the geopolitical dimension
Yeah.
of corruption, right? We're seeing, for example, one of the most devastating economic crises right now is not the pandemic that is receding, hopefully, not merely the climate shocks, which are the most devastating, and existential, but debt distress, crippling debt that so many developing countries have incurred for infrastructure projects that don't exist. And many people have got fat and happy on infrastructure deals that provided a fraction, even those that do exist, provided a fraction of the benefit at double or triple the cost because of some deal that was done which looked on paper like something that could be a real development investment. So we certainly, as democracies, feel that we have to get our own house in order, for sure. We've just passed in the United States a year or two ago the beneficial ownership law, finally, to make more transparent who the actual owners of companies are. President Biden is the first American president who has made combating corruption domestically and internationally a core national security priority in a presidential directive to all agencies. We've, at USAID, created our first ever anti-corruption task force. And we know that there are malign actors and governments, very powerful governments, who are continuing to practice infrastructure development, let's say, but in a manner that is going to create long-term development challenges. So if we can create alternatives, but also equip actors in society to render more transparent what is actually happening, that can change the political calculus within those societies. But if you're just operating and supporting civil society organizations and not also finding those reformers who exist within governments where that political will suddenly emerges, we also need collectively to meet those moments and support reformers from within states, even when there are only pockets of reform, because we need more of a critical mass in those countries that have been racked by this plague.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I may, I would stress that collective action approach to the fight against corruption. It's not only civil society that can do that alone, not governments, not business sector. We have to work together, and corruption will be there, as you say, Joe. The difference between countries and governments is the reaction vis-a-vis corruption. Corruption can happen anywhere and anytime. But civil society, citizens, and governments have to react. And how they react makes the difference. Because really what we need is public policies, mutual legal assistance, effective mechanisms, investigative journalists, civil society, and the business sector going beyond compliance to integrity systems.
It's very powerful. We've done those collective actions, countries like Iraq, Egypt, Qatar, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It has proven to be extremely effective because what you do is you look at the whole value chain, and somewhere, somebody finds something, and then you can close the loop and see where it all started out and where it originated. So we have a really good experience with collective
And corruption
actions.
can be very different. You have the grand corruption scale like Odebrecht that affected 11 countries in Latin America plus 2 countries in Africa with the same scheme of corruption. But with COVID, we found out that petty corruption, the corruption of the relation, within the relation of a public servant who is responsible for vaccination, for instance, and the individual who wants to be vaccinated, was also affected by corruption in many countries. The access to ventilators, the access to vaccine, that was petty corruption again in many countries. And when it started, the COVID, Transparency International really put an alert on the risks that we were facing. And after 2 years of the pandemic, we have seen scandals of corruption in relation to the emergency response in all countries in the world, even the most developed democracies. And we, every week, find a new scandal.
Yeah.
The UK is
we
particular.
have particular beacons of that kind of corruption. Yeah. It was really tragic, given that it was state funds on a vast scale being deployed to save lives.
Don't leave a vacuum because it will be filled.
Yeah.
Yeah. Delia, I'm curious, if we're trying to sort of send a message, or if there is, young people who are perhaps disengaged from politics, why should they sort of join the fight against corruption, and what can they do? I'm curious for all of your perspectives on that, because really this has got to be about the next generation, hasn't it?
Because when we fight against corruption or we talk about transparency, we are not talking just about information. We are talking about integrity plus information. And in order to participate, you need a system of integrity that guarantees values, respect, and freedoms respect, and also information in order to act effectively as a citizen. And that's very, very important in order to rebuild trust. At the very basic level of the problem of corruption nowadays, we have the lack of trust in institutions, in leadership, all across the sectors, lack of trust in each of one. The interpersonal trust is really being affected by misinformation, fake information, and the lack of delivery on parts of government. So we have to reconstruct that, and really the young generations had a very important place or role in this fight.
Yeah, corruption is the #1 source of poverty. So if you really want to increase, the greater good of the world, that's what where you can contribute. There's I heard the number 1.7 trillion or whatever. Just think about that number, and it's just, it's stealing from the people. And we are the people, everybody is, and the younger generation, has it's a great responsibility to contribute to the greater good of the world. And that's why they should fight it, and that's why they should go after it, and that's why they should, be a good watchdog also. And there is a lot of, you have the ombuds people, you have help desks, you can go any place. It's just important that the governments support those people, and protect them. Or even honestly, even reward them. I really wouldn't care. Just reward them because they're doing something good for the society. Whatever the reward is, I'm not sure about the money, but something. And that's really important because it's got to grow from top down. You've got to have a tone from the top, otherwise it's no good. And then you've got to squeeze it from top down, from the tone from the top to the bottom up approach. Then you can do something about it.
Okay.
And you find the bad people. Not everybody is bad, but you've got to find the right ones.
Livia, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you. I think citizens' involvement is, in fact, a key issue to fight corruption and increase transparency. And that includes, of course, new generations should be appealing to young generations also. And I think this is probably one of the reasons why Switzerland is scoring high on the transparency index, because our direct democracy, of course, involves a lot of citizens' engagement. So for example, we have all cantons and most communities have a financial referenda also. So the authorities have to really describe very clearly what they want to do, and people have to allow it. So this gives a much better control than if you have, of course, a very abstract structure.
Yeah, okay. Samantha, I was just very curious. A lot of the theme for Davos is about the energy transition. Why is it so important that this is tackling corruption is a focus, be it green minerals, be it subsidy schemes?
Why is I mean,
and why? Yeah. Does it strike you that there are quite a lot of opportunities there for rogue actors, for bad people?
I mean, I think the evidence is the world as it is.
Yeah.
Right now is not the world as it ought to be in this space. If I don't know, there's something almost about a mine. The great line that sunlight is the best disinfectant. A mine is kind of, almost metaphorically even the opposite of sunlight, and I think that is what we've seen in a lot of these big investment deals up to this point. So part of what we're trying to do again collectively as democracies, working with civil society, issuing challenges to the private sector is to create a coalition where corruption, the fight against corruption, is a design feature of new investments, particularly now with the race for lithium batteries and new mineral investments that are going to fuel the renewables transition. You can see the excitement here at Davos around renewables. Everybody is, of course, later than we wish we were to that transition, but it's only going to accelerate. It's only going to get cheaper. The demand for these minerals is only going to get greater. And yet, where are the safeguards in country? So what we try to do within our own government is we just had our Africa Leaders Summit. Those kinds of deals get struck between the private sector and, let's say, the government of Zambia. A very important mining deal was just struck at the Africa Leaders Summit. On the ground, what we do as USAID is look for partners to support who can actually be out there doing monitoring and verification. And this is true of corruption. It's also true, of course, of workers' rights. Because, again, in this intense flurry of demand, that is when people get, corners get cut, deals get cut, and the dignity of individuals, whether through corruption or through abuse of their rights, can be the first to go. So we need those safeguards on the ground and can't do one without the other.
And Nandan, very quickly, just the role of tech, because it seems that is a weapon that we have.
No, I think it's a huge role, and I think we have to think of institutional and architectural ways of solving corruption. I mean, I'll give you an example. Today, in the last 5 years, India has completely automated its income tax collection and refund process. So this has led to a dramatic increase in tax collections. India's GDP grows nominally at about 14%, but the tax collection has gone up to 40%. And that's because the whole, compliance has become much more stronger. People's returns are automatically generated from different sources, so they know that all the data is there. And there's something called faceless assessment. So rather than having the risk of a nexus between a person and the tax person, it's dynamically allotted to different people so that you don't have a permanent nexus. So these are all things you can do in establishing things at scale. Or our road transports now, all the toll collection is automated. So there has been a significant increase in collection, which leads to making roads more bankable because the return is guaranteed. So I think we need to think of, obviously you can't eliminate everything, but definitely a lot of things, especially that affect the common person, can be done in a very different way.
Okay. Technology has become really, really important at times of COVID. Where people our auditors couldn't go places anymore, looking at big projects and everything on site. So we needed to look more into remote controls and algorithms. So that's where technology really was extremely helpful.
Okay. We're really almost out of time, but I'm very keen to allow people to ask some questions. Would you like to go first?
So referring to the same corruption perceptions index that Madam Liu mentioned, 131 countries have made no significant progress against corruption in the last 10 years. And most of those countries, I bet, are from the global south, where we face considerable resource-constrained environments. And if it is the case that we should focus more on young people and technology to combat corruption, what is the role that development agencies, aid agencies like USAID and the Swiss Development Corporation can play to enable or create a more enabling environment for young people in the global south to combat corruptions in their own local places? Thank you.
Do you want to take a few just so we get some voices?
Go on.
Maybe?
And you too, please.
Hi, I'm Nora Bruba, Global Shaper from the Stockholm Hub. One thing that hasn't been mentioned so much in this panel is structural organized corruption or money in politics. It's eroding trust in public institutions, in governance. It's eroding and chronically underfunding our work on climate action, public services. How can we spotlight this issue? And I think it's important to recognize also that this is very much also not just a global problem, but also a global north problem. thinking about recent scandals in Europe, the American system. I'm not going to say too much about that, but how can we center that? And I also want to acknowledge that this is the room this week where it's the fewest people I've seen.
Yeah.
And
They're all watching online.
And I think that says something about this problem.
And then finally, would you ask as well? Because we want to ensure you get a chance to ask questions for when the clock ticks.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I came from Ukraine, and you've spoken a lot about Ukraine here. So first of all, a comment about the statement that corruption is the heart of the war in Ukraine. That's a statement that I hardly can agree, because at the heart of the war in Ukraine is ambition of aggression to take Ukraine out of the map of the world, metaphorically and physically, because some of the cities are just ruined to the ground. And we've spoken about technologies and digital transformation. But what I also see, referring to you, it's value transformation in Ukraine. And we've done a remarkable job with Ministry of Digital Transformation, IGA program, to basically put technologies out there. But we also see people who are not going to, fall into the same trap for the last 30 years. So what can be the lessons from the corporate governance transformations that you've made that we can take at the national level in Ukraine? Thank you.
Should I start that?
Yeah, Joe.
Collective actions. Collective actions. I actually talked to the mayor of Kiev last night, because he was asking about rebuilding Ukraine. And rebuilding Ukraine will also be about putting collective actions in place on that matter, because with all due respect, they've got other things to worry about today. But there's also fear of tomorrow, and Ukraine has been, one of those countries which have been extremely complicated in corruption. So rebuilding Ukraine will also mean, building robust systems on compliance.
Yeah.
And I hope we're going to get there anytime soon without losing so many lives.
Yeah. Samantha, would you take
Just
that point?
really quickly, let me just address this, because I think it's more directed at me even than you. I mean, to say that corruption is at the heart of the war is to say Putin was personally threatened by the fight against corruption and the strengthening of Ukraine's democracy. Would he, if it was still a corrupt system completely plugged in with his crew of oligarchs, would he have sought to obliterate the country in those circumstances, when he could control the country, when he could make money from the country, pillage the country? I'm not sure. Maybe. But I think that is what we were trying to say in terms of corruption. I just wanted to correct the record. On your, first of all, excellent point about the turnout here, but I'm going to tell myself that, like my parents, that they're watching online, all the CEOs. And all the world leaders. But on the question of youth, I would only say that what we're trying to do is we are very dependent on U.S. contracting partners, large international organizations. We are trying to invest much more in local organizations who are closer to the communities. So we have a localization agenda. It's not the best term, but it's about shifting resources and power to the communities in which we work. This should be obvious. But we're very, very weighted. More than 90% of our assistance goes not to local actors. So we have to shift that, and then not have programs for youth, but have youth integrated in all of, and insist on that as a design feature of programs, including those, though, that would draw young people into government. Because that's fundamentally, if we're serious about it being civil society, independent media, all the young people want to go start an NGO. Come. Work as a civil servant, or come as run for parliament. Be that voice that's going to pass a right to information law, that's going to pass an asset, recovery mechanism. I mean, there's so much to be done from within the state, but young people haven't yet really been convinced of that in many countries in the global south or in the north.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, I'm being told. So I would like to thank our panel, and I thank you all for coming.